Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this live conversation with one of our customers. We're so excited to have you all on. We're going to give people just a couple of moments to join, but in the meantime, I'll introduce myself. My name is Emily. I do content at GitLab and I'll be your host today. Before I introduce our guests, I'm going to cover just a couple of housekeeping items. First, this will be a little different from our other webcasts that you may have attended in that we're just going to chat. And we're really glad that you're here listening in, so please feel free to ask questions throughout the conversation. If there's any follow-up that you really wish I'd asked, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time. I'll try to keep an eye on the Q&A during the conversation, but there will also be time at the end for any other questions. And at that point, I'll also be joined by support engineer Cindy Payatis, so you can get expert answers to any of your GitLab specific questions. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can use the chat function to get in touch with the moderator for help also. For anyone here who might be a little newer to us today, you may only know of GitLab as a version control and code review tool. And while that's where GitLab started, we've since expanded our offering to bring you issue tracking, social coding, CI/CD, and monitoring into a single UI. And we're really proud that GitLab is the only product that covers the entire software development lifecycle. And now, with all that out of the way, I'd like to introduce our guests. We have joining me today the team lead for the Linux operations team at the Province of Nova Scotia, Steve Zink, and Unix technical specialist, also at Nova Scotia, Paul Badcock. Thanks so much, Steve and Paul, for joining us.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for having us.
So glad both of you could join. So we met, I think, on Twitter after you both co-wrote a couple of blog posts about your move to GitLab and how you went about implementing DevOps in your team. And we really wanted to hear more, which is what brings us all here today. So to start, can you tell us a bit more about what your team does at the Province of Nova Scotia?
Yeah, so we're responsible for Linux servers as well as a bunch of applications, of which GitLab is one of those. And as part of that, we're trying to expand into more of the DevOps practice and become experts in that area.
Great. So, Paul, how and in what context did you first hear about DevOps?
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having us today. It was probably around early 2010, somewhere around that time. I was working, as most people do, as a system administrator. I was working for a small startup, and basically there was a lot of overlap between the different teams of development and operations. We were supporting like a Ruby on Rails application stack that was like basically providing a service offering to our customers. And we found there was like a lot of need to not stop throwing basically application releases or a product over the wall to operations and expecting that team to support that application. So we were able to start to work together and like find out common goals and how to improve our product as a whole and actually go through a better release and support cycle.
Okay, so maybe DevOps as an idea had kind of been in the culture for a while and it was starting to gain momentum, maybe as a bit of a buzzword. So how did you begin trying to create DevOps, or a DevOps culture rather, in your organization, and what were your motivations in doing so?
Well, this really is a grassroots effort from the technical level up. We're technical specialists, of course. We work in operations, and what I've begun to notice as our organization grows is that we're losing touch a little bit with some of the development teams and how they're operating. So as part of that, what we've been trying to do is consolidate source code onto GitLab and that sort of thing, and then branch out from there. And what I found is that the relationship building between the groups has really started to improve, and we're starting to knock down some of those silos. But it's a slow process, but we've had some successes so far.
So more on that idea of this as a grassroots effort, do you think that that fact was really essential to your success at adopting these new practices? So for instance, for anyone listening who might have a different experience, do you think it could have worked top down?
I suppose it depends on your particular organization and the culture that you have, but I think I think that grassroots is the way to go because I feel like if our executive came down and said, you know, this DevOps thing, I want us to implement it, and all the teams varying skill sets and whatnot, varying ideas of how to do things are going to feel, you know, they may not feel comfortable doing that. So as a grassroots effort where we're trying to push it ahead, we're comfortable with the tooling, comfortable with the practices, and we're able to slowly grow that out.
That's been one of the big things too, is us like gaining more experience and working more with the clients to understand, you know, like what they actually need and what they're thinking about in the future. So by like having the do it from the grassroots, you actually start to find out more about what your client needs.
Got it. So moving on to some results, which I think folks listening will be especially interested in hearing about. There's some research to suggest that investing in DevOps and continuous delivery practices leads to more reliable delivery of business value. So from your experience so far, have you found this to be true?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, what we're noticing is that we're sharing information amongst teams a lot more. And the developers aren't working so much in a vacuum anymore where they used to be siloed and, you know, would throw their code over the wall to us. So that's working out really well so far. And also where we've got everything in code now, where you know, all of our infrastructure code, we're able to recover from situations much easier, especially when we bring new members online. They can just look at our code base instead of trying to pick our brains for every little configuration change we may have made over the years. Do you have anything to say on that, Paul?
Yeah, like one of the other good things that we got is like, as you mentioned, our infrastructure and code, but it's also giving everybody an understanding, you know, like of how the platform is set up and how everything is kind of like blueprinted for us now relating to certain projects. That's been one of the big, great takeaways from it. And one of the other things that we found is that I'd say, like, you know, there's the saying of a bus factor. You know, like if somebody actually gets hit by a bus, you won't lose that knowledge. So that's something that has been like a great value, because if something had happened, you know, like at least that's documented in version control somewhere now for us.
It's great to have a contingency plan, although, of course, I hope it doesn't come to that. So following up a little bit on results, can you share any of the metrics that you're collecting in order to see the value or reduced waste of your new practices?
That's been something that we didn't consider when we went into starting more of a DevOps kind of practice. We didn't have good ways to measure like key performance indicators of, you know, like time to resolve a ticket or something of that nature, how many tickets we were actually logging against infrastructure. So if that's one thing that I can kind of convey to people to do, is try to have some metrics that you can work off the beginning. But with the actual GitLab itself, it's been easier for us. We've been starting to implement some of the new time tracking on issues and on our merge requests to actually get like more cycle analytics as we're using the product more. I mean, like there's basic stuff that you could try to track, but unfortunately, you know, like if you have nothing from the beginning, it's kind of nebulous and you don't know what you've actually improved upon.
Got it. So it sounds like that's an ongoing sort of challenge. And in addition to those you just alluded to, what have been some other challenges that you've faced so far, and how have you tried to resolve them? And especially if you think that if there are any that are applicable to other teams, those would be great to hear.
Well, the approach that we took was to get our house in order in terms of the infrastructure as code and to become experts in the products suite that we chose. And once we were able to demonstrate the value of being able to provision more quickly and having this code base, we've sort of taken that out to the development community and started to demonstrate some of the tooling that we have set up within infrastructure. So, the CI/CD and that sort of thing. But what I found is the relationship building is the difficult part. But when you can present it in such a way that it's beneficial to all involved and it's not so much of a infighting type scenario that sometimes you run into, it's been good that way.
That's great. So along those same lines of relationship building and people breaking out of their usual orbit, maybe, have you witnessed any culture shocks, for example, from risk management or security and compliance teams?
Well, the security team in particular has been happy because we've rolled some security automation into a couple of our builds, and we can generate reports from that. So that's been nice for them. There hasn't been any organizational change because, like I said, this is grassroots, and we haven't gotten to the point where the executive would consider shifting orgs or that sort of thing. But I would say there's a bit of a culture shock when we're being more proactive in reaching out to our clients instead of waiting for them to come to us and toss the application over the wall to us. So that's been a positive thing for sure.
Great. So now I'd like to ask a few GitLab specific questions. We're always interested in hearing about that. How did you decide that GitLab was the right choice for your team?
When I started with the government of Nova Scotia, we weren't using any kind of SCM for our teams to store any of our configuration management code. So we were looking around and seeing what was available, basically what kind of offerings that we had internally, and none of them seemed to fit particularly well for us. And from previous roles and experiences, like I've worked with basically a lot of the major competitors and a lot of actual community source projects. But we found that GitLab was ideal fit because of the self-hosting aspect was very big for us. And the ease to actually use the product. The Omnibus installer is a fantastic feature, and now into the world of Docker containers, it's very low barrier of entry to use and test the product. So that's been something that we found was very good fit for us. And it's been something that's been working out really well with the implementation over the past couple of years of the GitLab CI engine. So we've been leveraging that heavily instead of standing up traditionally a separate Jenkins server or anything of that nature. It's been a nice little box of a suite of services that we don't have to worry about. That's very easy to configure.
That's great to hear. So what are some other particular feature sets that you used? And can you tell me if there's any in particular that you found really worked or really didn't work for the team?
Yeah, we've been pretty much testing out or using most features and seeing how they have fit for us. And also a big thing was what our clients have found very useful for them in the DevOps kind of role. So the merge requests have been instrumental for us. It's been very good to work with a client that owns a product of their code that they want to deploy, and we actually just have developer access on their code repository, and we do everything through merge requests. That way it gives us the ability, to not be touching their code or making any changes that they're unaware of. and they've been using it also for basically doing gated releases or peer review. It's been one of the major things that we've been doing internally with our configuration management code, that we all go through a peer review, and we do that through our merge requests. It gives a lot of oversight for us, so that's been really great for us. The pipeline features of the CI engine has been really good. We've been trying to leverage them in different ways to do different releases of either our internal, like we use Puppet for configuration management, for doing testing of Puppet, and for actually releasing. So once we go through our merge request, for example, it will go through and do, or before it goes through our merge request, it will go through all the testing of the code. And once it's been merged, we use the pipeline to actually push our code into our production environment. Using that with the pipelines, the CI engine has been really good, the GitLab runners. And we use those basically to do all of our continuous integration testing that we're doing for continuous delivery. Another part that we use quite frequently is the Mattermost aspect of the product. And that we've been using for a lot of our cross-team discussions. And it's been good for us because it keeps like a history of chat. I mean, like it's very, very comparable to like service offerings such as Slack, but where it's self-hosted and on our premise, that's been really good for us. The downsides or things that we didn't actually use for different reasons, the snippets, we don't have a need to share a chunk of code. Usually if somebody's exploring something, they'll just use a branch inside of the GitLab or the Git and actually share information that way, or through different mediums that we use, such as, like, say, OneNote. And going along that lines, we don't use the wiki aspect of the product at all. Most of our notes and documentation, either we use OneNote to record information, such as playbooks and standard remediation, or if it's related to a product, we've been using more and more Markdown and actually keeping those knowledge reference inside the actual project itself.
Interesting. So I would like to hear a little more about that and ways that you'd like to see GitLab improve in the future. But first, I'd also like to remind our viewers to please submit any questions you have for Steve and Paul, or also for Cindy, our support engineer, who's an Enterprise Edition specialist, and she can answer those after the session. But I haven't seen any questions so far, and I have about 3 more of my own. So just a heads up there. This next one, yeah, so for either of you, what are some ways that you'd like to see GitLab improve?
I'll start with this one, I suppose. It would be nice to see a Jenkins-like plugin ecosystem. So oftentimes we can, search for a product and CI/CD, and you'll often find Jenkins-related stuff. It would be awesome to be able to take those plugins and plug them into GitLab. So it'd be interesting to hear what GitLab's roadmap is for that. And probably the only other particular issue that I've noticed is that the UI and the user experience changes quite often. So if we could stabilize that a little bit, it might be nice. Having said that, I do know that on your last release, there's a tick box to enable or disable the new interface. So that was nice.
Yeah, and going along that, like when we've been like showing clients, they'll come back like after a minor release, like there'll be a big change, for example, of like where something was located or how something was hidden, and that's been some issues for our clients, like understanding some of the changes. But another thing we've had, or we'd like to see improved, is like the offering the runners more as a service. It's been one, it requires us quite a bit of configuration to get a runner up and going, because you actually have to log in at the runner engine itself and force it to connect to GitLab, and then basically pass a token back and forth that way to basically authenticate the runner to the GitLab server. So having an easier way to either deploy or trust a runner and be able to scale out to many runners and move them very quickly would be something nice, either like using Kubernetes or OpenShift or something of that regard.
Interesting. So probably Cindy might be able to weigh in, maybe if you feel like it now, Cindy, or later, but if you have any thoughts about those suggestions. If not, I would like to I'll drop it in the chat. We do have a direction page where you can see a rough plan mapped out for the next 2 to 3 and 3 to 6 months, and it does change. We are always open to feedback, and I can also look for any issues that are currently open regarding those points that you brought up, but we definitely are always looking for feedback. So as we start to wrap up, I just have a couple more questions to go, but I'd like to look forward a little bit. So could you tell me what, if any, DevOps initiatives you have currently going on at Nova Scotia?
Well, we're just continuing the sort of grassroots approach where Paul and I are actively meeting with our clients, demoing GitLab, and I find that once we can get their source code into GitLab, we're able to then branch out and start taking advantage of some of the other features like CI. The other thing that we're working on internally is a pilot of Kubernetes. So hopefully we'll be able to deploy from GitLab straight to Kubernetes, which would be really interesting. Those are the two things that are top of mind right now.
Very exciting. So, and you also wrote in your post that you're really hoping to get other teams across the government to also start using some DevOps practices. Can you share any kind of next steps for that potentially other teams might be able to use to influence those around them?
Yeah, so we're actively, we are meeting with folks, and once we demo these things, it sort of starts to take off from there. We're bringing in external people as well that are sort of experts in this area, so that they can hear it from people other than us, which is really nice. And from there, I expect things to blossom. It's just slow going, but it's a process.
All right, it sounds like there's always more work to be done. Sorry, Paul, did I cut you off? Did you want to add something?
Nope, that's fine, thanks.
All right, so thank you, Steve and Paul, for your insights on your experience so far. Now I'd like to open it up in case there are any questions, either for Steve and Paul or for Cindy, our Enterprise Edition Specialist. It looks like there's one so far from Adam Reed, who asks, does the province of Nova Scotia have a need for test result collection? And if so, how do you handle that in GitLab?
So it's an interesting question. Some of our clients that are using GitLab right now, they don't have the need to keep it, but we've been finding that's kind of like something good for historical kind of references, and basically to go back to and see how your product has been improving. There's been certain things that we've been using. For example, we've been trying to use the code coverage analysis, basically with custom rules to actually like give a percentile of how well we're doing on, say, for example, on our configuration management code of like how many of the units are actually have tests constructed around them. Other ways that we've experimented with it is artifacting reports. So basically we can preserve like either HTML output or something of that nature that we can reference in the past, and we set certain artifact parameters around that to keep the reports for certain periods of time. A very basic way to handle the test results, for example, is just failing builds. And that's been something that we've been using. For example, we use Test Kitchen on our Puppet environment with server spec, basically, to actually do the tests of that our configuration management code is working as intended inside of a Docker environment. And when we do that, basically, if the server spec or the test fail for that, we fail out that way and send an email notification to the team. Other things that we could do, what we don't do right now, is use more of a chat ops kind of approach, and you leverage Mattermost to, let's say, report in the channel that it also had failed, so it's more visible to a larger group of people.
Great, thanks for that, Paul. All right, I do remember seeing that you'd followed, and you also talked about this a little bit earlier, that you followed the GitLab open source project from early on, and you replaced the Atlassian suite with GitLab, and I wondered, and you'd used it in previous roles, I wonder if you've like how you've gone about getting buy-in from other team members to make the change, or if that was necessary, and what the conversation was like there.
I had used Atlassian basically in 2 prior roles, and we've always found from the cost perspective, getting into Atlassian is cheap. Once you go past a certain point, it becomes very expensive for the suite of products. So in our startup environment, once we started adding more QA people into the process, once we started adding more developers into it and management wanted oversight, once all those user counts started adding up, basically it became very cost prohibitive for us to continue down that route. So we started looking at different products at that time, and we chose GitLab to be used inside the company. That really has been something that I've taken forward with me into different roles, and now here at the Government of Nova Scotia, it's very cost effective to use GitLab for us. And like we had evaluated some other products and looked at some other solutions, but it was pretty much ticked all the boxes of what we needed.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing. So if we were all in a room together, I'd say give it up for Steve and Paul. Thank you both again so much for joining us. It looks like we're almost out of time, and it looks like there's no other questions that have been submitted. So I would like to share both of their email addresses. They've said they'd love to answer any follow-ups that arise after you leave this call. So please feel free to get in touch. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. We hope to see you on a future webcast.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.